Now, this summer marked the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. And as such, it also marked the 3/4 of a century mark since the famous words, "It worked," fell out of the mouth of scientist Robert Oppenheimer. He had just witnessed the world's first atomic bomb in its testing, a device named Gadget. Gadget was around 5 feet in diameter. It had cables going around everywhere, masking tape, fuse boxes all around it. Many people said it looked like a big round elevator case. It was awkward. But it was the beginning of the atomic and the nuclear age. And it brought with it the horrifying possibility that mankind could now wipe itself out within a matter of minutes. Now, the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They brought the war to a close. But that didn't end the danger of nuclear weapons. Accidental nuclear war has almost happened many, many times since then. And with 15,000 nuclear weapons still existing worldwide, thousands of them on hair trigger alert, and ready at a moment's notice, some say an accident is bound to occur at some point. In fact, dozens of accidents have happened, near misses, close calls. Many of them have been made open to the public, often decades later. I've wondered what Satan thought when he first saw a man experiment and then perfect an atomic and nuclear explosion. Knowing that possibly this brought things closer to an end time, but also gave him the opportunity to wipe out all of mankind rapidly. God, our creator, the creator of mankind, creator of the atom, knew that moment would come. It was no surprise to him. He designed history in advance. God's intervention in events is not willy-nilly, it's not happenstance, it's not a figure-it-out-as-you-go type of situation. Millennia ago, God, who knows the end from the beginning, as we know from Isaiah 46:10, set forth a definite scheme of history, as revealed in the ancient prophecies of the Bible. Now, at times, God has had to intervene directly to influence events to conform to his desired goal, his timetable, and his overall master plan. We have many examples directly given to us in the Bible, and as well as through history. For those whose eyes are open, we can see that. We can see God's hand directing the affairs of individual men, entire nations, key battles, or international affairs. We can see that at times God has used weather, odd weather, as when the massive Spanish Armada was destroyed in storms and unable to invade England. Other times, history kind of took a strange turn, such as the famous Battle of Tours, when the overwhelming Muslim army suddenly heard rumors and turned back away from sure victory, and they fled. They fled to a near devastating defeat. Later, an unstoppable military horde appeared ready to annihilate Europe. But then there was suddenly an untimely death of a leader back in the Far East. They left. They never returned, without reason. Other times, God has raised up leaders at critical junctures to intervene in human history. Other occasions, as we'll go into today, God has provided protection from what could have been cataclysmic events. Now, the German Kaiser, Otto von Bismarck, famously said, "God has a special providence for fools, drunkards, and the United States of America." Today, I'd like to show you that through a handful of events, that Bismarck was right, and America has been protected by God for a special purpose. And these events, perhaps we'll call them non-events, because they show how, in both small and in big fashion, this nation was protected from massive destruction, but death and a frightful nuclear war. Not only do I want to touch on these events, but give a reason. Perhaps there are many more that I don't share, but there's a reason, and a reason why the protection was provided. And hopefully this will reassure us during a rather confusing period that we've had for the last few months, that God is on his throne and everything is going according to his purpose. In January 1961, just 4 days after President John Kennedy took office, during a routine flight over North Carolina, a B-52 bomber spun out of control and dropped 2 Mark 39 hydrogen bombs on the city of Goldsboro. One bomb broke apart upon impact, and the other endured minimal damage, falling deep into swampy soil. Official documents showed that 5 of the bomb's 6 safety devices failed. And the only thing that prevented a massive thermonuclear explosion and nuclear detonation that day was a safety switch that had been notoriously unreliable and known to malfunction. As the then Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, said, by the slightest margin of chance, literally the failure of 2 wires to cross, a nuclear explosion was averted. It was not the right time. It was not the right time. It wasn't the right time for a massive nuclear explosion that could have triggered a nuclear war that might involve hundreds or thousands of thermonuclear weapons and threaten the very existence of mankind, because Jacob's descendants had not fully received the blessings or earned the full punishments that we read of in the Bible. Jacob's descendants had not received the full blessings nor the full punishments recorded in the Bible. Now, Winston Churchill, for example, clearly perceived God's hand in history. In an address before the U.S. Congress in December of 1941, the British Prime Minister asserted that he must indeed have a blind soul who cannot see that some great purpose and design is being worked out here below. On another occasion in Britain, some 10 months later, the wartime leader further expounded his belief in a divine intervention, observing, I sometimes have a feeling of interference. I have a feeling sometimes that some guiding hand has interfered. Though not called, Winston Churchill had an understanding that some things don't add up. There had to be divine intervention. Benjamin Franklin had a similar conviction. Speaking at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, Mr. Franklin said, the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? It didn't make sense. He said, no, if he can deal with sparrows, he can deal with empires, nations. He saw that. Now, God closely watches world conditions, and often intervenes to ensure that events unfold according to his plan. And that plan was set about thousands of years ago, and Abraham and the blessings of his obedience are part of it. In Psalm 33:10, Psalm 33, verse 10, it says, let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the people of the world revere him. For he spoke and it came to be. He commanded and it stood firm. The Lord foils the plans of the nations. He thwarts the purposes of the peoples. But the plans of the Lord stand firm forever, the purposes of his heart through all generations. Centuries in advance of their fulfillment, the ancient inspired prophecies of the Bible outlined a very definite, unmistakable progression of world empires. We see that from the Babylonian, continuing through the Medo-Persian, the Greco-Macedonian and Roman Empire, beyond. Very clear. Additional prophecies foretold the fates of numerous and major cities and nations, numerous individuals In all cases, the pages of history have confirmed the unerring accuracy of these prophecies. Though we can look back and clearly see God's involvement in the formation and growing power of the United States, in the 1950s, America had only a handful of years before it had ascended to the preeminent spot, replacing a worn-out Britain that had virtually become bankrupt from 2 world wars. So in the 1950s, the United States, from an international geopolitical point of view, was ascending tremendously. And these descendants of Jacob were going to be given their opportunity to see if they would obey God after being given incredible blessings. God clearly afforded the United States protection from enemies, but how would the tribe of Manasseh do with prosperity? We'd had protection with 2 incredible oceans, but what about prosperity? How would that affect? As we know, the United States has rejected God in many ways, but our merciful Father gave the nation time, at least a century now, as the wealthiest nation in human history, to see and enjoy his blessings and protection before he begins to remove them in a dramatic fashion. Turn over to Deuteronomy 28. We're familiar with this, the blessings and the cursings. Deuteronomy 28, starting in the very first verse. Now it shall come to pass, if, this is one of those famous if-but areas of the Bible. If you do this, but if you don't. If you diligently obey the voice of the Lord your God to observe carefully all his commandments, which I command you today, that the Lord your God will set you high above all nations of the earth. And all these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you, because you obey the voice of the Lord your God. Blessed shall you be when you come in, and blessed shall you be when you go out. The Lord will cause your enemies who rise against you to be defeated before your face, and they shall come out against you 1 way and flee before you 7 ways. Verse 8, the Lord will command the blessing on you in your storehouses and in all to which you set your hand, and he'll bless you in the land which the Lord your God is giving you. The Lord will establish you as a holy people to himself, just as he has sworn to you, if you keep the commandments of the Lord your God and walk in his ways. Then all the peoples of the earth shall see you, that you are called by the name of the Lord, and they shall be afraid of you. And the Lord will grant you plenty of goods in the fruit of your body, in the increase of your livestock, and in the produce of your ground, in the land of which the Lord swore to your fathers to give you. The Lord will open to you his good treasure, the heavens, to give you the rain and the land in its season, and to bless all the work of your hand, if you heed the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you today, and are careful to observe them. So you shall not turn aside from any of the words which I command you this day, to the right or to the left, to go after other gods to serve them. But it shall come to pass, if you do not obey the voice of the Lord your God to observe carefully all his commandments and his statutes which I command you today, all these curses will come upon you and overtake you. God gives blessings to nations and to individuals, and then sees how they will be used. Whether God will be praised, whether God will be obeyed. And if not, then there's the but part of it. Then you'll get the second part of those blessings and cursings. America and the modern Israelitish nations have left God, and they'll suffer the consequences. Russian naval officer Vasily Arkhipov is often remembered as the man who saved the world. In October of 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, a tense standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union, the United States Navy discovered a Russian submarine. It was hiding in the Caribbean. Unbeknownst to the Americans, the Russian submarine had a nuclear torpedo aboard. But the Americans didn't want it. They didn't know that, it had that on board, but they started dropping basically grenades or depth charges to sound it out and to try and get it out of the area. They had no idea. The Soviets aboard the sub had lost touch with their headquarters. They suddenly were under the impression that war had started. Can you imagine, with explosions all around the submarine? They were unsure of what the Americans wanted, and they feared that the war had started already. 2 senior officers on the submarine thought a nuclear war had already begun, and they began the launch sequence to eliminate a major U.S. force with a nuclear torpedo. The submarine commander ordered the nuclear missile prepared. It was ready for launch, but they needed a third person to sign off. Arkhipov was that man, and he refused. He said, "This isn't an attack." He reportedly argued, suggesting the Americans simply wanted to talk and meant no harm. Well, eventually, to the consternation of many aboard, they did rise. The sub rose to the surface, where it was met by a U.S. destroyer, and then headed back to Russia. In that moment, in that time, Vasily Arkhipov dissented, preventing a nuclear exchange, and potentially prevented the end of the world. Was America protected? I would say yes. It was not the right time. It was not the right time. The gospel had not been preached to the world or a people prepared. The gospel had not been preached to the world or a people prepared. Many nations now have nuclear weapons, and like every other weapon devised by man, they'll likely be used. The prophet Daniel speaks of what is called the time of the end, or as the Moffat translates it, the crisis at the close. The crisis at the close. The crisis of all crises. Christ later warned repeatedly about the worst time of suffering in human history, but he said something else comes first. In Matthew 24, especially around verse 14, it says, And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall come the end. Then shall the end come. So something has to come first. Now, if the gospel had been preached around the world in the year 800 or 1200 or 1900, that would not have fulfilled Matthew 24:14. It wasn't even technologically possible for the true gospel to even go out to the entire world until Mr. Armstrong made it available, until he started a work that spread out from a very tiny part of Oregon to the largest television and radio stations in the Western world. And then Mr. Armstrong spread that message in meetings with world leaders. And today, by way of the internet, more people have access to the true gospel than at any time in human history. That work wasn't done in 1960. It wasn't done then. It couldn't have been done. Psalm 34, verse 17, Psalm 34:17 says, "The righteous cry out, the Lord hears and delivers them out of their troubles. The Lord is near to those who have a broken heart and saves such as have a contrite spirit. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all." Once again, it was a people being prepared, a people being protected that had to happen. Jesus warns us that all concerning that the end times and the great tribulation, and unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. And although we don't know the day or the hour of Christ's return, we know when the time is near. You can see that from some of the things that are mentioned in that same chapter, Matthew 24. God says, watch world events, in verse 42. And those events give us a time frame. The events date these prophecies. God says, let those who read this understand, or they're in trouble, because we will have to flee into the mountains. There's something that people have to do. It's not just God doing everything. God expects us to do something too. But a people have to be prepared and protected so before some of these things happen. Thirdly, in November 1979, American nuclear bombers were readied, and intercontinental ballistic missile crews went on highest alert after the NORAD computers communicated that a major Soviet attack on the U.S. was underway. Within minutes, satellite data failed to confirm the supposed attack, and it was deemed a false alarm. It was later revealed that a technician had put an attack scenario training tape into an operational computer by mistake, nearly causing World War III for real. We think it's bad if we don't get a communication or a good video or audio feed from church. This is real problems from the communications and computer errors. After this error, just months later, in June 1980, President Carter's National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, was awakened at 2:30 a.m. NORAD's computers were going again and had detected a launch of 220 missiles from Soviet subs towards the homeland. Forces immediately began being readied for a massive nuclear retaliation. Then Mr. Brzezinski got a second call. He said, "I'm sorry, sir, that first call was an error. It's actually 2,220 missiles that are on their way." Mr. Brzezinski said he had to go immediately see the president. He got up. He didn't wake his wife. He said, "No, if this is the case, it's better for her just to sleep through this." As before, it turned out to be a false alarm. In this case, it was caused by a flawed computer chip that was later replaced for 46 cents. Another error that could have caused a massive nuclear conflagration, but I believe God protected. Now, these were not the only times that almost nothings occurred that had nuclear forces scrambling. Nuclear forces where there were planes launched, alerts on the highest hair trigger levels, and nuclear codes being readied. One time it was because of an intruder on a Minnesota Air Force base. It turned out to be a bear. Forces were recalled. Another time it was a flock of migrating swans. Another time it was the launch of a Norwegian scientific rocket on a mission to study the aurora borealis. But it had Russian President Boris Yeltsin looking and reviewing at the nuclear launch codes. Another time it was reflections from a moonrise over Norway, and it was mistaken for a Russian missile attack. And there's been famous times, and even as late as 1983, where military maneuvers, one called Able Archer by American and NATO troops, was mistaken as an attack, and forces were readied. Again, in each one of these situations, it was not the right time. It was not the right time, because the correct lessons would not have been learned by mankind. Mankind wouldn't have got it if it was just a fluke, an accident. When mankind discovered nuclear weapons, many feared that science's final gift to mankind was the ability to destroy himself. Frightening legacy. It was foretold in our Bibles nearly 20 centuries in advance. Human beings have incredible intellect, but they lack the wisdom and the spiritual character to avoid misusing that intellect. In Jeremiah 10, verse 23, we see that the real answers do not lie within ourselves. Rather, as Jeremiah says, "O Lord, I know the way of man is not in himself. It is not in man who walks to direct his own steps." The lessons of mankind needing to rely on God for protection. The positive God's way of give, and the negative aspects of Satan's way of get. Such accidents, had they happened, would not have taught man those lessons. They would have just said, be more prepared, get your technology correct, double check things. They would not have understood that God is on his throne, praise and obey God. They would not have thought that. But mankind, only at the end of this age, will learn those lessons in the very hardest of circumstances. Be turning over to Ezekiel 7. We'll see that the rejection of God has consequences. Ezekiel 7, starting verse 2, "And you, son of man," and here we see what this rejection brings. "And you, son of man, thus says the Lord God to the land of Israel, an end. The end has come upon the four corners of your land. Now the end has come upon you. And I will send my anger against you. I will judge you according to your ways and I will repay you for your abominations. My eye will not spare you, nor will I have pity, but I will repay your ways, and your abominations will be in your midst. Then you shall know that I am the Lord. Thus says the Lord God, a disaster, a singular disaster. Behold, it has come. An end has come. The end has come. It has dawned for you. Behold, it's come. Doom has come to you, you who dwell in the land. The time has come. A day of trouble is near, and not of rejoicing in the mountains. Now I will soon pour out my fury and spend my anger upon you, and will judge you according to your ways, and I will repay you for all your abominations. My eye will not spare, nor will I have pity. I will repay you according to your ways, and your abominations will be in your midst. Then you'll know that I am the Lord who strikes. The world is spiraling towards destruction, and many will suffer, but it won't be accidental. God has a plan being worked out, and he's going to teach mankind some hard lessons. And he's trying to reach people to help them repent, because like a father, he's trying to reach his sons. Hebrews 12:6 says, for whom the Lord loveth, he chastens, and he scourges every son whom he receives. God doesn't want people to have to go through this, but they're going to have to. As it says a little bit earlier in Hebrews, in chapter 10, verse 30 and 31, it says, it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. So when someone responds positively, it brings beautiful results. And it'll bring a great multitude eventually, which no man could number, into his family, as we see in Revelation 7. And ultimately, the right timing and the right lessons will be learned, and they'll do much to prepare the whole world to come to know him. In 1983, it was already a moment of extreme tension in the Cold War. President Ronald Reagan had rejected calls for freezing the arms race, declaring the Soviet Union to be an evil empire. The Soviet leader, Yuri Andropov, was obsessed by fears of an American attack. In September of that year, the Soviet Union shot down a Korean Airlines plane that had drifted into Soviet airspace, killing all 269 people aboard, including a U.S. congressman. That episode led the U.S. and the Soviets to exchange warnings, trade threats. With nerves on edge, it's not surprising that the world nearly fell into a horrific nuclear exchange, not once but twice that year. With that background, early on September 26th of the year, the Soviet Union's early warning system suddenly started beeping. It started going crazy. And it warned that 5 Minutemen intercontinental ballistic missiles had been launched from an American base and were headed towards Russia. Soviet military officer Stanislav Petrov was on duty at a secret command center outside Moscow where Soviet military monitored early warning satellites over the U.S., and the alarms went off, shocking him. He was responsible for passing along those alerts to his superiors, the alerts up the chain of the command. And for 5 minutes, as he sat holding a phone in one hand and an intercom in the other, he didn't know what to do. He was shocked. He was trying to absorb streams of information to see if they made sense. And Colonel Petrov, against all his training, against everything had been drilled into him, said, no, this must be a malfunction. It can't be accurate. And he didn't inform his superiors of it. It's said that he prevented the deaths of what is estimated at 2 billion people with that decision. It was a costly decision for Petrov. If he'd been wrong, and somehow he had survived an American strike, he would have been executed for treason. And even though he was right, he was relentlessly interrogated for years after that and never rewarded for his decision. It wasn't the right time. It wasn't the right time. Evil in this world and the rejection of God was not complete. Now, Israel was in Egypt for 430 years. As we see in Genesis 15:16, we read of how Abraham's descendants would have to remain in Egypt for that point of time, much of it in slavery, before taking possession of Canaan. And there's a reason given. The reason is for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. It wasn't just about the Israelites. It was the evil on this other people in Canaan hadn't reached a climax yet. In essence, they just hadn't reached that point of no return. And it was the same for Noah. In Genesis 6, we read of God's sorrow at the creation of man, but he still waited. He raised up Noah, and then instead of wiping out mankind instantly, he gave Noah time, 120 years, to prepare an ark, but also to preach a message, a warning message. Most of the points that I've mentioned, they apply to what happened with Noah as far as having to be prepared, having to be protected, warning people. We read in Matthew 24, verse 37 through 39, but as in the days of Noah, as they were, so shall also be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away, so shall be the coming of the Son of Man be. It's going to be very similar. It had to reach a point, and it's more than just marrying and giving marriage. There was a lot of evil going on. And where is that evil? Well, we can read that in 2 Timothy 3. 2 Timothy 3, 1 through 5. We're all familiar with this. But understand this, that in the last days there will come times of difficulty, for people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having the appearance of godliness but denying its power. None of that is surprising to us today. We read that list and we're like, yeah, check it off. It's all there. It describes our age perfectly. But mankind does not learn easily. And just think of the last 2 decades. You can think of the time when you finished college or high school or wherever and put yourself in a certain time period. How much has this nation changed in this last decade or 2? The prophet Daniel speaks of a time of trouble, such as there never was. And the book of Revelation depicts scenes of future battles and warfare unlike anything known in ancient times. The Apostle John saw in vision the weapons and the armies of the future. He did not have words for much of what he saw. He could only compare it to things with which he was familiar, things he saw on a normal, regular, everyday basis. Yet we can discern much from his descriptions, describing the use of military force, likely including nuclear weaponry. John uses the language of his day to describe futuristic weapons, out of whose, quote, mouth issued fire, smoke, and brimstone. We see that in Revelation 9:17. John is not describing conventional weapons, for he tells us that this massive attack will destroy a third of humanity. Verse 18. How can weapons destroy a third of humanity? A destruction on a scale that's impossible without the modern weapons of today. Now, what we've gone over have been errors, scary errors, possible misses. And they're scary, but there's a time that's coming that's even far more frightening. Many have seen the recent explosion that happened at the port in Beirut, and it's frightening to see that, and to see this explosion, and that was just on a minor scale. But the newest nuclear weapons just entering service for some of the major militaries around the world are scary beyond belief. The Tsar Bomba was a bomb developed, it was the largest in history. It's over 6,000 times the size of the bomb that landed on Hiroshima. Well, it's now re-entered the Russian service. It's now known as the Satan II, interestingly. It's a massive mega bomb. And it can annihilate not just a city, but an entire area the size of Texas. The United States has entered in and put in what they call low-yield nuclear devices upon their submarines, because they now see, according to our nuclear doctrine, the possibility that we might use tactical nukes, meaning in warfare, rather than just as a last resort. The low yield means it's more often it's a chance of it happening. Hypersonic missiles are the latest rage. Both Russia, China, as well as the United States have entered and built these hypersonic missiles. They glide horizontally through. They act erratically. They're supposedly not able to be hit by any anti-missile weaponry because they also go at a mile a second. A mile a second with nuclear weaponry. And then we also have undersea nuclear drones named the Status 6 or Canyon. They can travel 6,000 miles undersea, submerged, and they can cause a massive radioactive tsunami up to 1,600 feet high. Think about that. That's over 150 stories high to wipe out vast areas. It's unmanned, and according to some reports, it's also been linked to what they call the dead hand. The dead hand, where if it loses communication with its headquarters, it operates remotely, going to its location and exploding. The dead hand. Describing the final destruction of Babylon, the ancient headquarters of the beast power, the Apostle John again describes something that can only be understood in the light of modern-day weaponry of mass destruction. Therefore her plagues will come in one day, it says, and she'll be utterly burned with fire. And the kings of the earth will weep and lament for her when they see the smoke of her burning, standing at a distance for fear of her torment, saying, Alas, alas, the great city of Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. You see that in Revelation 18. The time has not come at this point, and God has stayed man's purposeful or even accidental use of civilization-ending weapons. But that time is coming. In Matthew 24, verse 6 and 7, we read that things are happening now with increasing regularity. Wars, rumors of war, droughts, famines, earthquake. But there are still things that have to happen. We have not seen all the curses of Deuteronomy 28 yet. We have not seen a beast power arise to prominence. We have not seen a false prophet with many signs and wonders. We have not seen the abomination of desolation or a great tribulation, such as was not seen since the beginning of the world to this time, nor ever shall be, as it says in Matthew 24. So there's still things that have to happen. But those things are just around the corner. And this season, this time of year, represents the time when God finally says, it is time. It is time, as pictured by the Feast of Trumpets when Jesus Christ returns. It is time when, a couple days from now, as we symbolically note on Atonement, when Satan is removed. It is time. So in conclusion, the course of history has been directly influenced and guided by providential intervention, that unseen hand of God. Sometimes he intervenes in obvious ways, sometimes less obvious and not known for decades or forever. Human beings now have the technical capacity and the twisted mindsets required to annihilate all human life. It's why in verse 22 of Matthew 24 we read, and except that those days should be shortened, no flesh would be saved. That prophecy could never have been fulfilled before. It couldn't have been fulfilled in the age of the bow and the arrow, or the musket and the cannon, or the howitzer and the tank, or even the airplane and the aircraft carrier. Only in the last 75 years, since Oppenheimer's invention, have human beings possessed the weapons of mass destruction that threaten to destroy all human life. In that brief time, it appears that mankind has nearly triggered such devastation multiple times by accident, by misreading, by nervously or technical error. The fact that God sits on his throne watching and influencing events here on earth, including the likely holding back of nuclear warfare for now, can be really reassuring to know that God is on his throne. God is directing world events. We don't have to worry about it. God is directing it. It's not going to happen until God is ready. It will happen when God says it is time. And until that time, it should give us comfort that during this time of turbulence now, that God is watching out for us as we draw closer to him.